At that time, we didn't have Tina Fey and Amy Poehler. Had we had them, life might have been very different for me and other comedic actresses, because they have figured it all out, and it was still being figured out at that time. Well, I would describe her as being very narcissistic, because she never knew anything else. She grew up feeling that she was perfect and with all kinds of money and doted on by her parents. But she wouldn't marry the man they wanted her to marry, or she did marry him and left him, that's right. And he was about 75 years old. So my father, played by Jose Ferrer, who was hysterical, insisted that I had to earn my own living if I wouldn't stay married to this elderly man. So that's what caused Stephanie to wind up at the inn working as a maid. When I first came on the show, I was a guest star, and I was really more of a plot device, as most guest stars are. And I was fleeing from the man I was engaged to and wanting to have a one-night stand with somebody, which I had with the cafe owner next door, Kirk, who was on the show the first 2 years as a character. And it made Bob's character very uncomfortable, because I was talking about how I wanted to do this passionate thing, this one-night stand, and at first he thought I was talking about him. And it quickly became clear that it was very funny to have Bob encounter a very girly girl who's very shallow and had lots of girl problems and talked about herself all the time. It was a wonderful thing for him to react to. I always felt that we're all like that. Everybody's pretty narcissistic until they're about 4 or 5 years old and have to be taught that the world doesn't revolve around them. But that had just never changed for her. I think everybody kind of wants to be that way. And she never meant anyone else any harm. I think she truly loved Dick and Joanna, and they were parental figures for her, which she hadn't had around her for a while. But it was just hard not to think of herself all the time. But she was very emotional. I always wanted her to be a very emotional character. It was a funnier thing for Bob to react to. And I didn't want her to be cold and snooty. I wanted her to be narcissistic in a very emotional way, not in a personality disorder way. It came immediately, because I had been watching him for years, and I was absolutely crazy about his comedic style. I loved it. I loved his timing. It wasn't like anybody else's timing. He always had a very courageous comic timing. He could wait so long to get to the joke, to set it up as best it could be set up. He could really drag it out, hence the stutter. And I admired that always, and I loved playing against that. The comedic timing that you can introduce with somebody who stutters is very interesting. Usually the rhythm is rather zippy and back and forth when you're doing comedy. Everyone always says faster and funnier. Most directors have that note. But you can't be faster and then funnier with Bob. That doesn't work. You simply have to be a counterpoint to the hesitation and the stuttering. It's a whole new kind of comedic timing that I'd never had with anyone else, and I haven't had since with anyone else. I don't know, maybe we should just pretend that we can't reveal our tricks like magicians, that it's that mysterious. But you will see comic actors asking each other things all the time. Is it funnier if I take 2 steps before I turn at the door and say something? Is it funnier if I take 4 steps and say it and then turn around? And we all know what each other means. That's our common language. And we would ask each other questions like that all the time. And it mattered. That tiny little thing always matters. Whatever works is the best way to go, of course. And everybody's going to be different. All actors are different in some ways. Bob had such an innate solid knowledge of exactly what would be the funniest way to do something. And if we all started to talk a little too much about what would be funniest or what would seem right, he'd after a while get up and go sit down and read the newspaper. If we were talking too much like thespians, we'd lose Bob for a while, and then he'd come back. And I can remember him saying things. He didn't give unsolicited advice very much at all. But every now and then he'd say something like, you know, if you just turn and say it, just try that. And I would, and he'd be right every single time. And another story that I have about Bob and his comic timing is that in the first year of the show, they had me on the phone with my parents a lot. I would be calling home, complaining about how hard it was to be a maid, because of course I'd never cleaned anything. And they were very funny phone calls. But doing a funny phone call with Bob Newhart watching is a little unsettling. And one of the first times I was doing one, I noticed him standing over there, he wasn't in the scene, watching me. And I got very flustered and I said, "Stop watching me." And he said, "It's a lot harder than it looks, isn't it?" And I said, "It really is." Because you have the reality, you have to leave the time for the person on the phone to say something, and that has to be realistic. Then there's the comic timing, and then there's the audience's laughs. So you're doing about 3 times as much work as you are when you're just doing a scene back and forth. It's not easy, and I would try to imagine him doing it as stand-up night after night, where he had to listen to a different audience, maybe laugh in a different place, as he's doing the other person on the other side of the phone in his head. And I think that may be where that hesitation came from, is the phone calls and the comedic timing of them, because they are at least 3 times as hard to do as any other kind of comedic delivery. I think the secret was that we did so much laughing all week during rehearsal, or what we like to call rehearsal, but was a lot of collapsing on the floor and laughter, that we were so nervous by the time the audience came in, because we'd realize we've never really gotten through it, have we? Because we kept fooling around and cracking each other up. And so the nerves on show night helped a lot. Well, every audience is so different, no matter how many audiences you have. And Bob was more aware of the audience than anyone I've ever met. The sound of the audience was so important to him. He has such an ear. And he would come in on the day after the show aired and say, "Well, how did you think the laugh track sounded last night?" We recorded the audience live, so by laugh track I mean it was our audience from that night. And the sound of it would be incredibly important to him. And he wanted it to be just right and to sound very genuine. And it's a little tricky to do a live performance with laughter. It's tricky sound-wise to get it right. And he was constantly aware of how they sounded and how they were doing. And if we were losing them, sometimes you have to do pickups. You have to do something over and over again for various reasons. And he would worry, we're losing them, because the audience would get restless. Because otherwise, why do we have an audience? The point of bringing in an audience and doing it in front of an audience is to get what you cannot get without them. And nothing mattered to him as much as the audience. Because you might possibly get a little stale during the week rehearsing it, and the audience would bring you right back into the present and make it all new and fresh again. And it's wonderful when they laugh at something you weren't expecting, and you you had no idea that that line would get such a big laugh. Yes and no. He really knows what to use of himself. He's a consummate actor in that regard. And so I don't know how much he thinks he's using. If he says 85%, then I'll buy it. I don't know if I would have come up with the same formula from knowing him. I'll have to think about that. We tried to get through it in a very short period of time because he was so concerned about the audience and did not like the way the energy would fall if it got late. Now, I know sitcoms that would be shooting until 2 in the morning. It's hard to believe it could be getting funnier at that hour. Nothing gets that funny after midnight. It doesn't keep getting funnier. But we knew shows that worked that hard and that late. And I think Bob always felt that if you're working that hard, it can't be that funny. Well, I think that Bob was always glad to have funny characters around him because he was so unique in that he was funniest when he was reacting. Whatever you did was funnier if Bob was in the scene. It didn't matter how funny it was funniest if Bob was in the scene. I did a show where I sang Old Man River in a cocktail dress, as only a white, waspy, rich girl can sing Old Man River with absolutely no feeling whatsoever. And it's a very, very funny idea, but it was so much funnier because Bob was watching it in the scene. Well, everybody would be different. There's such a scope to Bob's reactions. There's so much comedic scope there, which is why he was on television year after year, because it never got old watching him react to people. And there were so many different ways for him to react. He'd react one way to Larry, Daryl, and Daryl. He'd react another way to George, who would talk on and on and on. Another way to Michael, who drove him crazy. And another way to this girly girl who was so caught up in herself and came from an entirely different world than he ever knew. And they were all so valuable, so there just couldn't be enough funny characters around for him. He was like the audience, and there's nothing more wonderful for the audience to see than to see someone representing themselves and how they would react. It's a great key to comedy. Somebody needs to be in the audience's place in reaction to these extreme characters. And he was always that, and so precisely that it made all of it funnier. At that time, we didn't have Tina Fey and Amy Poehler. Had we had them, life might have been very different for me and other comedic actresses, because they have figured it all out, and it was still being figured out at that time, I felt. There were people who thought that dumb blondes were very unpolitically correct. Now, I think they're a comedy staple. We have to have them in their various forms. And if it's funny, it's politically correct as far as I'm concerned. Funny is funny. And most comedians feel that way. But at the time, we were sort of coming out of the 70s, where there was a lot of girls running around in very little clothing on sitcoms, in comedic situations that were somewhat demeaning to women. And people were offended by that in some way, and they didn't like that as role models for women. And yet, why couldn't women be funny? But you had to be funny and not demean women in any way. And nobody had blazed that trail very much at that time. And I think it's been blazed now. It's all okay now. It's all clear now. But it really wasn't then. It was confusing. I was, at that time, when I was playing people that young, I was very influenced by Gracie Allen, Jean Harlow, Carole Lombard, and Imogene Coca. Imogene Coca because she did wild, slapsticky routines, but she was somehow always a lady. She never lost her dignity, even when things were being thrown in her face. Not in a Margaret Dumont way, because she really went with it and played wacky people. But to me, she was still somehow very classy while she was doing it. I never felt that she demeaned herself in her comedy. And I was so aware of that kind of thing because other people were so aware of it. It was tough. You always felt that you should be walking a line somehow. How can I be funny and really outrageous and not be somehow demeaning my character or females in general? And I think Bob understood that, and we all tried to be very pure about our comedy. We tried not to be topical. The writers tried very hard not to be topical. Everybody wanted it to be funny in reruns 20 years later. It mattered to everybody. And I think we achieved that for the most part. The shoulder pads give us away, though. The look of the 80s was not our best friend as far as having everything hold up 20 years later, but I think the comedy does. And it was the purity of everybody's approach about comedy, especially Bob, but Tom and Peter and Mary, that helped be a funny lady for me. It helped a lot that everybody was so pure in their comedic approach. Well, I thought that going back to role models that were, to me, classic, such as Carole Lombard, was the key to my not letting the political correctness of being a funny woman get in my head. I didn't like it when people put down the idea of a dumb blonde as being something that we shouldn't be allowing on TV because it wasn't a good role model. I thought it was a classic and a staple of just like any other comedic character. Very necessary. Dumb blonde narrows it down quite a bit. And I thought that the writers gave Stephanie a great deal of comedic scope beyond just the simple dumb blonde. In fact, stupidity was never really her thing. That was more Larry, Daryl, and Daryl than it was Stephanie. But the emotional range that they gave my character helped a lot, I think. It made her so human because she was so emotional and not just dumb. But if you look at Gracie Allen, that's about the cleverest dumb person you've ever seen. And she always thought she knew better and felt a little sorry for people who didn't understand what she was saying. She didn't understand that she was dumb at all, or that she was saying something dumb. And that's all comedy gold. Well, it was very challenging in many ways. It was a pretty challenging situation for everybody on that show. It was very worthwhile because I worked with actresses that taught me a lot. I learned a lot about comedy, acting, and they were just great role models as women. And that was wonderful. As far as playing a flawed character, everybody has to be on the same page so you know how flawed, in what way. You have to have these parameters that you all agree on. And that was probably the most difficult part. Well, it's so weird to be well known for a role that you didn't get. There's so many roles that I haven't gotten, but people don't know about them, but they know about that one. It was very fun. It was an entire week of auditioning, as I recall. They were very thorough, and I played it entirely differently, and I knew that I did. And I think that everybody wound up with it where they were supposed to be. I think everybody made the right choice there. My consolation prize was NEWHART, which I found out shortly after that, so it was fine. Yeah, you're like the designated hitter. Well, it's very difficult being a guest star. It certainly can be and has been rewarding sometimes, but you don't have a relationship with the writers. You can't really work with them. And most of the time you are a plot device to, in some way, help the show, help the regulars on the show, show different sides of themselves. So it is not quite like anything else you ever do. And sometimes it works out, and sometimes it doesn't. I recently did a guest role on The League on FX, which is an entirely improvised show. And it was so much fun. You have to jump in and be a member of the ensemble when you do that. You just have to. You have to get comfortable quickly, and because you're improvising relationships and history. And that was probably the most fun I've ever had doing a guest role. Well, you do. Any actor does. You're always thinking in terms of the character, and sometimes that's different from what the writers think, and you have to explain to them why it matters to you so much. And yet it's a wonderful collaboration with the writers when it works. And for instance, when I sang Old Man River, I just had this image in my head that it would be very funny to have a rich white girl singing Old Man River. And I said, that would be really funny. And so they wrote a show where I could sing Old Man River. It's the reason everybody gets in this business. That is the job that everybody gets in the business for. It was idyllic. It was a family. We had fun. We laughed all day. We used to laugh so hard sometimes, and Tom would throw back his head while he was laughing and say, "And we're getting paid." He loved to say that. We all appreciated it. We knew it was probably the best time of our career. We knew it all along. We knew how rare it was. We'd all been around long enough and had enough of a career to know that it was very, very special. It just doesn't get any better than that. There was an episode where Bob got mad at me because I took his car, and I didn't want him to know that I took his car. It was very fun because you never saw him get mad, and it really threw Stephanie for a loop, who was used to not caring that much what other people thought, and then she really did. And that was very important for me character-wise. I loved that. I always loved the episodes where I made him very uncomfortable because I tried to talk to him about something very serious. And I'm trying to think of a good example. Well, there was an episode early on where I went bowling, and I disdained that, of course. I had never been bowling. And Bob came back, and I was sitting alone, I think, as I recall. I can't remember. And I was very sad, and he wanted to know what was wrong. And I said, "I like bowling." And one of the very few times he gave me advice, he said, "Cry when you say you like bowling." And I did. And he was so right. And just the audience reaction was fabulous. Oh, once I can get past the shoulder pads, I find myself pretty much being critical of what's funny and what wasn't, and much more distanced from it than I was then, so that the way in which I'm critical is probably a lot more valid than it was at the time. And I never watched them a second time at the time, so I only had my first reaction, which was usually too much of a gut reaction. So it is interesting sometimes to watch them now, although I never do, but I should. Well, we worked a 5-day week, which a lot of sitcoms stopped doing. They would work a 4-day week. And we never stopped doing that, even though we often didn't rehearse on Mondays, but we would come in and read the script. And Bob easily could have said, "I want a 3-day weekend," because he was Bob Newhart, but he never said that because he respected the rewriting process so much, and he knew they had to hear it because he was all about hearing the comedy, and he knew the writers needed that. So we came in, we read the script, and we would talk about it, and the writers would talk about it, and sometimes Bob would hold the script and weigh it in his hand and say, "Needs more jokes, I can tell," from the weight of the script. And sometimes we rehearsed a little bit, but usually we went home, and then they would do a rewrite, and on Tuesday we'd come in and we'd have a new script, and we would look at it and talk about it. We'd read it through, we would rehearse it. There would be a run-through sometime in the afternoon on our feet, still holding our scripts, and there would be discussion, and they would do their big rewrite night on Tuesday night. And we'd come in on Wednesday, and we'd have a lot of rewrites if they were needed, or not very many rewrites. And we did the same thing on Wednesday that we did on Tuesday. There would be another run-through, and there would be more discussion. Hopefully there wouldn't be too many rewrites. And on Thursday, we spent all day camera blocking and running lines. At least that's what we were supposed to do when we went in the green room and shut the door while they were rehearsing the camera's movements. And sometimes they shut the door just because we were laughing too loud and distracting them. And then on Friday, we came in and we got into makeup and we did more blocking with the camera. And the audience came in at dinner time. We ate, we came back, and we did the show straight through, usually in order, hopefully without too many pickups, sometimes with a lot of pickups, depending. And sometimes with a little conference over to the side if something wasn't getting the laughs they wanted, and we would try something different in front of the audience. Try to get them to laugh as hard when we did it the second or third time. And that was the routine. And that's the way I thought it always was going to be until I went and did other series.